Muchas gracias por conectarse al seminario de microeconomía aplicada. Este seminario va a ser grabado y posteriormente ustedes podrán verlo a través de la página web del banco. Hoy tenemos como invitado al doctor David Whooper. Déjenme darle la bienvenida a David en inglés. Our guest today is Dr. David Whooper. He's professor at the University of Bonn in Germany and head of the Land Economics Group at the same university. Professor David is going to present the paper Institutions and Global Crop Yields. So please, let's not interrupt him during the first 10 minutes of the presentation. He's gonna welcome questions and comments after those 10 minutes. You can just unmute yourself to say what you wanna say. And hi, David. So good evening in Bonn. And thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. Very happy to be here and talk to you, and also to get your feedback on this paper, because it's still a working paper, so still any comments can be incorporated into the final product. And it's joint work with Wolfram Schlenker and Meha Jain and Hayu Wang and Robert Finger. So it's an international project with multiple people involved. And yeah, the title is Institutions and Global Crop Yields. And we try to find out how, at the global level, institutional changes affect crop yields, with the idea, if we would change national institutions, how much could we improve global agricultural productivity? So I will quickly go over the study background now, and then I will start with two separate parts that are in this paper, because the paper has two parts. The first part is about identifying the effect of countries on crop yields globally. We do that by focusing on border discontinuities in crop yields at country borders. And then the second part is where we link those discontinuities to changes in institutional quality. And then we will have a small look into which institutional factors matter most, because we have an institutional indicator that's based on a lot of individual sub-indicators. We look a little bit into the mechanisms. So why do institutions change crop yields? And then a very small discussion in the end. So that's the layout for the talk. Just as a quick background motivation, I guess I don't really have to motivate this a lot for you if you are interested in agricultural economics, but we know that crop yields differ enormously between countries, right? We know that even neighboring countries often have very different crop yields in all continents. Everywhere we see huge differences between countries. And we see this pattern that often the lower income countries have especially low crop yields. There seems to be some correlation with income, but that could, of course, be for many reasons. And the one thing that we also observe is that many countries have far lower crop yields than they could. So probably you know the study by Adamopoulos and Rastocha, where they show that these huge differences in productivity across countries are not really environmental differences. Many countries are far below their potential in terms of their weather and their soils. And the really productive countries are mostly those countries that have other technologies, including fertilizers, seeds, all these things. Yeah, we have a lot of proximate explanations for this. We know that the countries with low crop yields have low agricultural investment rates. Farmers don't buy a lot of fertilizer, they don't build irrigation infrastructure, they don't have a lot of machinery. So these proximate factors, we know that farmers in low productivity countries often have not so well developed insurance markets, they can't get easy credit. These factors, and then profitability. The research of Zuri et al., for example, of Zuri in Econometrica in Kenya, where she showed that even these very obvious things like modern seeds and fertilizer, even these what we think are basic and affordable innovations, that they are not profitable often for farmers for multiple reasons. So we know the proximate factors, and we have a lot of research on the proximate things. Most of agricultural economics focuses on the effect of these individual things, like what's the effect that farmers cannot get credit, or what's the effect that farmers don't have good insurance. So all these proximate details. What we don't have a lot in agricultural economics are these very big fundamental factors, like what could be things that underlie a lot of these things. For example, country institutions. Of course, economics is full of research on institutions in general. This was the beginning of economics, and then Acemoglu, for example, now very famous economist working in general, showing that institutions are important for income, for economic growth, for all of economic development. But again, we don't have it for agriculture. We don't have the clear link. How important are countries' institutions specifically for the agricultural sector? So that's exactly the gap that we try to fill here. There are a lot of definitions of institutions. It's really difficult to decide how do we actually even want to measure institutions, or what do we understand as institutions. I think every time I'm talking about institutions, people have different ideas what institutions are. So generally, we follow the Lind-Nugent definition that we say institutions are the behavior rules that govern and shape human behavior. So you make your choices because you have certain expectations, and these expectations are to a large extent set by the institutions. So you can see with this definition, even culture would be a kind of institution. We would have these very, very different institutions. We focus here on one specific subset of institutions. We focus on formal economic institutions. Of course, there are also political institutions. Again, we also don't focus on those. So political institutions, you could think about democracy or dictatorship, or how is the democracy exactly organized, these things. Economic institutions, we rely on the Fraser Institute Economic Freedom of the World Index, which has a couple of advantages for our research. So first of all, it's available for almost all countries annually over a long time span. It is very transparently constructed. It's clear how the indicator is produced, and it has a numeric 0 to 10 scale, which makes it easy to interpret. And it has all these individual characteristics in there. So there is rule of law, there is regulation, there is control of inflation or credit market regulations. All these individual institutional factors are in this indicator, and they have one overall summary indicator, and then they also provide these sub-indicators individually. And we use both of these sets for our analysis. This is just two periods that I'm showing here. So the left side is the Fraser Index over for 2000, and then on the right side it's for 2019. We have it for every single year, and we show that in the paper. You can see in 2000 there were some missing values still. You see there is some white spots, and then they disappear relatively quickly. So we have relatively complete data over time. It was 2000, the first year they just started. But something else that is actually really nice that you can see here, there is a lot of change. And we see that at some point we also had an animation of this. I unfortunately lost the animation, so I'm just showing the maps here. But there are a lot of annual changes. So this is not constant that you say, okay, there are countries that have always higher values, but actually we have all changes and we have switches. And you as researcher in Colombia, you are aware of the case of Venezuela just next to you. There are major changes over time and major trends. Some countries that hugely improve over time and some that hugely deteriorate over time. And all of this is great for research because then we can really exploit all the variation globally and see what happens. We can even concentrate just on country pairs where the relationship has changed over time. So this data brings us a lot of variation to work with, even though, of course, there are some patterns that are stable. You can see North America has always been pretty high in economic freedom, as to expect, and some other countries have been always pretty low, but it's not just a stable relationship. That's what I want to communicate here. Okay, and then how do we actually analyze now the effect? Because, of course, at the global level, saying we want to have all the countries in the world, and then over 20 years almost, how can we actually credibly identify the effect of institutions? You can imagine there's not really an instrumental variable available here, or many economic techniques are not really possible here. The one idea that we came up with is to have a kind of difference in discontinuities design here, and we do it in 2 steps. We first estimate discontinuities, and then we put it into a panel setting, and I show that in a moment. So the first step is that we say growing conditions are often relatively similar around country borders. If you're just crossing international borders, very often growing conditions, soils, rain, temperature will be quite similar. So if we find discontinuities in crop yields at these country borders, this is most often globally the effect of that the farmer is in one country or the other. If the corn yield, for example, in the US is really high and you just go over the border to Mexico and it drops, that is not because of environmental reasons, but that is because of difference in investment. So the technology is different. And the same as if you go from Germany to France or all these examples, of course, there are sometimes environmental differences, but very often they're not. So what we have is we use satellite data. We have 83 million pixels at a resolution of 1 kilometer. So just for you to imagine, 1 kilometer is 100 hectares. So it's not super small, but for global analysis, it's pretty small. And we measure with the satellite how green a pixel is. We focus only on cropland. So we say, how green is the cropland? But we don't use the mean, but we use the median. So the maximum, sorry. We use the maximum because the issue is that sometimes there is no crop on the field. So we measure the color of the ground. Or sometimes there's something else on the field that's not the crop actually. Sometimes there's just fallow or completely different crop. So we don't want to, or maybe there's even some bushes or some trees around the field and they're also measured. So we don't want to measure all of that stuff. We only want to measure the yield, and the highest enhanced vegetation index value in the year is usually the main crop. So usually the peak is caused by corn or rice or wheat or the main crop that's grown there. And then what we do is we estimate a discontinuity for each country pair, so for each border and for each year. And then we link that to the Fraser index. And we do that in a standard panel model with fixed effects. Important thing is we need to have the lack of institutional quality, because we don't think that a change in institutional quality will change the yield in the same year. So we don't think an institution improves and in the same year we see a higher yield. We would expect that the farmers at least have to make the investment and the crop needs to grow, and after that there can be an effect. Yeah, we have a review paper on regression discontinuity designs where we describe a lot of these details. The important thing is what we find, just in case I'm not going through everything, we find that we play around with different lags And after 5 years, basically, the effect stabilizes. So we don't have to consider much more, but up until 5 years of lag, we see that the effect grows. And we do find that this Fraser index that is measured from 0 to 10, for each point change, the yield changes by 2.2%. So you could imagine the maximum yield increase possible going from the worst institutions to the best institutions would be somewhere around 20%. So it's not a major effect. This is not a huge silver bullet, but it's also not nothing, because I think we know very few things at the global level that increase crop yields a lot. So I think for almost nothing we know, oh, if you change this one variable, there's a huge effect. So yeah, I would say this is like a reasonable effect, something that we also expected. We also do find an extensive margin effect, meaning that when institutional quality changes, there is a change in cropland extent, and we find its cropland expansion at the cost of forest. So economic freedom, this is also not very surprising. Economic freedom in the sense that the institutions just let the economy free, and there is a positive effect on the crop yields. This combination is incentive for farmers to actually grow more, to go into the natural environment and grow more crops at the expense of forests in this case. And what are the factors that predict crop yields the best? We have to be a little bit careful, because this is not as airtight or as waterproof as before when we talk about these averages. So looking at every single sub-indicator, but it's still, I think, interesting. So what we're finding is inflation, credit market regulation, and top marginal tax rates. Those are the sub-indicators that drive our results. So pretty macro. I think all of us are usually thinking, or all of us co-authors at least, we're usually thinking for agriculture mostly in micro terms. And here, the thing that we are identifying is really stability and these big things that you are probably very interested in, things like credit market regulation and taxes. Okay, so here I'll show these images when I try to explain the method to people, because there are some really striking images from around the world. This is the cropland around the border between Turkey and Syria. So you could basically leave out the border and you would know where it is. Because in Turkey, the fields are very green, and in Syria, they are not. And this is not a recent phenomenon. So this is not driven by the war in Syria or some conflict or anything that you would think happened in the later years. But actually what this is, this area used to look like the part of Syria. And then the Turkish government invested quite heavily in the agriculture sector, and they wanted to grow more. So they invested in infrastructure like irrigation, fertilizer, and so on. So that's what you see here. And we have a couple of those examples from around the world where we really see border discontinuities with the naked eye. And if you switch to our data, which is this huge database of these global pixels, I can show our data just for this border, so I can exactly replicate in our data what you just saw on this photo. So here you have the log EVI, which is our measure for crop yields on the y-axis, and then you have the distance to the border. The border is exactly in the middle. And then you have Turkey on the left and Syria on the right. So negative border distances just mean that the pixel is located in Turkey, and a positive border distance means the pixel is located in Syria. And then we create bins because we have so many observations that you couldn't really see the pattern if we would show all the individual pixels. So the bins have a width of 5 kilometers and the pixels are 1 kilometer. we dropped the pixels right on the border. It doesn't really change our result, but we thought that is a good idea so we don't have overlap, that we don't have a pixel that's 30% in one country and 70% in the other, but we want to have a clear and clean cutoff. But actually, it does not change the results. And so here what you see the bins in Turkey, the crop yields, and you see them in Syria. So this is the trend. And you can see the trends are interrupted right at the border. And that's exactly what you saw in the photo. So after having seen the photo, I don't think you're surprised to see this pattern. There is a jump in crop yields. There are high crop yields in Turkey, and then you go over the border, and then the yields are low. And if you do this globally for all borders, you get the first impression of how important are country level variables for crop yields. But of course, you don't really know why. All right, so that's our first step. The first step is that we try to have these discontinuities. And then some details. We did create border segments just to make sure, because there's not always cropland on each side. And we want to avoid that we actually compare pixels that are very far away, because at some borders there's just a little bit of cropland on the one side and a little bit on the other. So we make these smaller bins so that we are only comparing croplands exactly going across the border, because that's what we usually want to do with the regression discontinuity design. We just want to have pixels on the exact opposite side of the threshold. So that's what we achieve with the bins. We only focus on cropland. So in our satellite data, we have two classifications of two different kinds of cropland, and we use both and then control for them with fixed effects, because the one cropland class is a little bit more mixed than the other. One you can think of as more this large scale, relatively homogeneous cropland, and the other are more these mosaics, small fields, small farms, and then some natural vegetation in between. So because one will generally be more bright than the other, we include both, but then have fixed effects for both. And then for the extensive margin analyses, we just use all the pixels, and we simply look at whether a pixel changes, let's say, from forest to cropland or from grass to cropland. And then we run the equation separately for each year. And then we also control for some stuff, as suggested in the literature. So we have some quadratic terms for temperature, precipitation, solar radiation, and we control also for soil classes. But the important thing is what we save in the end are border discontinuities for each border and for each year. We vary the bandwidth. So the bandwidth can be quite important. First of all, there are different ways to determine the optimal bandwidth, and often with different codes, you get quite different values for the optimal bandwidth. And sometimes the bandwidth can really change your results. It's because you're fitting these lines. So depending on how far away from the border you get, the shape of the lines, the slope might really change. So it could really make a difference if you only focus on the first 15 kilometers of the border, or all 100, for example, or even wider. And there's a trade-off. Smaller bandwidth means the pixels are more comparable. Larger bandwidth, you have more data. So we usually show a range of results for these different bandwidths that we use. And one more thing is we excluded borders that had very little cropland. I show you a map. Of course, we would love that every border just has perfect cropland on both sides, so we can do this analysis in a perfect way. Unfortunately, many countries do not comply and don't have a lot of cropland near the borders. So if you have in mind, yeah. Question?
Hey, David. Yeah. Oh, it's not very clear to me, maybe in the past slide, how did you calculate these discontinuities? I know you said that you will calculate like a beta for every combination, like the border and the year. Can you maybe dig further about what are the variables that you use as controls, and to understand a little bit better how do you come up with these betas?
Yeah. So there are slightly different ways to do this. The simplest way is you can use a linear regression and you control for border distance. Actually, I should go back to the image. This actually shows it the best. So what you do is you control for the border distance, so you fit exactly the lines that are shown here. And then you can just include, if you do this for one border, you can just include a dummy variable for the border. And the dummy variable will tell you whether on top of the general spatial trends, there is something special about the border. So this dummy variable will directly give you the discontinuity. And if you do this globally for all the borders, you just have to include a border fixed effects so that you're making sure, or these border segment effects even, that you're making sure you're only comparing observations from the same border and not across different borders.
And do you include any controls, like which variables do you use?
You don't have to include controls. So the baseline could be you just control for border distance, and the border distance will control for everything that is continuously distributed across space. So changes in rainfall or temperature will usually just be continuous, so they will not cause a border discontinuity. But for robustness, we included environmental things, like we included specifically then rainfall and temperature and soils and these things, exogenous factors that could potentially cause border discontinuities if a border just happens to have a natural feature. As you can imagine, some borders do have that. Some borders are in favor. I think I'm showing the border between China and Bhutan. And Bhutan is just right on the mountain. So you go up to the mountain, it's China, and you go up and there is Bhutan, and then they are completely different environmental things.
Okay, we have another question, Luz Adriana.
Thank you, David. Just some clarifications. You mentioned that you dropped some parts of the pixels of the pictures, and I wonder if you delete also the forest, because you mentioned just you focus on the crops, not. But my question is, why why you exclude the forest? Because especially, for example, in Colombia, it's very important. We have the Amazons, like between different countries, we share these parts, and the institutions are important, especially in that part, because we have a lot of illegal. How you said that, I don't know, but traffic of the forest, let's say, and I think they make a difference, no? Institutions in this, no, it's not crops exactly, but it should be part of the analysis, I guess, that you are analyzing or studying. So I wonder if you delete it and why, because I think it's interesting to include it also. That was just my question. Thank you.
Yes, we did not delete them completely. We just did separate analyses. So we have one analysis in the beginning where we just want to have crop yields. We just want to know, on a field where maize is grown, do they grow more maize if the institutions are better? And because what we are measuring is actually how green is the pixel, we don't want to confuse very high maize yield with just a very green forest. So for this first analysis, we have to be very careful that if a pixel is more green, it's really an indicator of more crop production and not because the land cover has changed. So that's why for the first part, we are very careful to only focus on cropland. But then for the second part of the paper, we look exactly at land cover change and we see exactly whether there is deforestation. And we do find that there is deforestation indeed. So countries with more free institutions, less regulation, in these countries, the crop yield is higher, but these countries are expanding cropland at the expense of natural forests.
I see. Thank you very much.
We have another question, Camilo.
Thank you, Carolis. Thank you so much. Thank you, David, and nice to see you again. I have just a follow-up question from Carolis' question as well. It's just a little clarification thing. When you mentioned you run the regression by year, by border year, if I understood well, I apologize if I didn't do it well. Let's suppose we have in this case, the Turkey and Syria border, and you then segment it, right, into different pieces. So let's say for the year 2000, you have all the segments from that border. You have all the pixels around those segments from the whole border, and that's what you use to estimate the discontinuity. Is that right?
Yes, but the discontinuity is just one number per border.
Oh, okay, it's one per border.
Separate indicators for each segment, but for the entire border of Turkey and Syria, I get the number that is exactly the distance that I'm showing here, the red.
Gotcha. Perfect. Okay. That was all. Thank you.
Yeah. All right.
I thought Juan Esteban had a question. No?
No, thank you, Carolis. I'll ask later. Thank you so much.
All
okay,
right.
David.
Yes. All right. So we have now estimated the border discontinuities. Now the important part up. One more, just to emphasize. So what we need in terms of data is we need high resolution crop yield data that is measured independently of the institutional quality. So we don't want to have any statistics from countries, because then there could just be measurement differences from, like, some countries measure or report their crop yields in a different way. The nice thing is with the satellite data is we really have uniform measurement all around the world. So it's both spatially and temporally really consistent, measured in the same way. And there are studies that have made comparisons between the satellite measured crop yield and actual measured crop yield, and there is quite a good correspondence. The one limitation that we have to keep in mind here is, actually there's one more that I have not written here. So the first one is that we only get the highest yield of the year, of the season. It could well be that in some places farmers actually manage to squeeze in one more rotation, one more round. So maybe they have 2 harvests and now they have 3 because they made some investments. So those things we don't have. Or if their second best harvest improves, we also don't measure that. We really only measure the peak performance here. In 1 year, what's the highest yield that was achieved on a pixel? And then the second limitation that I have not put in here, but I have thought a little bit about this, and this is indeed a limitation. We might have a little bit of attenuation bias here, because the satellite measured crop yield has a little bit less variation, very likely, than the actual crop yield. It's a little bit narrower. So we might find slightly smaller effects than the actual effect because of this measurement error, basically. All right. So here, because you just asked about the bins, this is the example of Turkey, Syria again. This is how the bins look. So you can see we create these nice bins around the border. So we have these good comparisons, and we include them as fixed effects. And then we control for border distance on both sides. And we include also, just to make sure, longitude and latitude and a square term between these. This is again an alternative way to say we are controlling for spatially continuous confounding factor. So anything that's not jumping around, but that's just changing from north to south or east to west is controlled by this. This can sometimes be important. It's not really here because at the global level, everything averages out, but it's still good to do this. This is then what we end up with. So remember, we are excluding places with too little cropland, and we need, we need in general places with cropland near the border. So the red borders that you can see here, those are the borders we cannot do what we try to do. So all the way up, the border between Norway and Sweden has just not enough cropland. Or you say, unfortunately, Colombia doesn't have a lot of cropland near borders. You have too much forest near your borders. But then there are a lot of countries where this works quite well. Okay, coming to linking border communities to institutional quality. That was our main interest, actually. So there are several problems with these cross-sectional discontinuities. The first one is, at some borders, natural factors might change across the border. So the discontinuity in crop yield could still just be natural. It could just be that on one side of the border, naturally the vegetation would be more productive than on the other side. Then there is a lot of other stuff that changes between countries. That's not the institutions. It could just be culture, because we are focusing here on economic institutions. So it could just be that there is one country where for some reason there is a culture that is really good to have high crop yields for whatever reason. And these are just examples of things that could be different. So what we do is here, we link changes in the border discontinuities to changes in the institutions. So we are thinking that a lot of the things we are worried about are more stable over time, that they vary less than institutional changes. Because what I have told you in the beginning, that institutions change so much all the time around the border. If you think, let's say, Colombia and Venezuela, the institutions have changed dramatically over time. But if you think about cultural differences between Colombia and Venezuela, I mean, there are cultural changes, of course, but they're probably slower moving than the institutional dramatic change that we are observing. That's at least the idea here. And then one more thing, we looked at how many legs we should include, and also whether our effect is actually linear, because we are assuming here a linear effect, and we wanted to see, is this actually a sensitive assumption that this is just linear? Might really be that institutional changes only matter for countries with very low ranking institutions, or only for countries with very high, or only those in the middle. You could make up a lot of stories why institutions don't matter all around the world. And I have really heard from people very different ideas. So I have heard from some people that at the lower end an improvement doesn't matter, and from other people who said, okay, at the higher end it doesn't matter. So we had a look. This is a restricted cubic spline, so non-linear regression. And if we include just one leg, so this is institutional change 1 year back, we do actually see a little bit of a non-linear function. That means that higher institutional quality leads to a bigger effect of institutional quality improvements. So actually, this is in line with the idea that if you have very bad institutions in this dimension, then a little bit of an improvement doesn't help so much, but it's more than if you already have good institutions, then improving them more helps more. However, this is not really the story, because if we include more legs, we see that the effect improves or increases. So this is to be expected. I mean, agriculture is a slow moving sector, right? Like whatever happens in agriculture, it's not immediate. You don't change something and the crop yields jump up, but you make good things, like good improvements, and then it takes a while until you see the results. So we include more and more legs and we get a higher effect. That's absolutely to be expected. And the effect becomes more linear. So this is to me really interesting to see, actually, if you look long enough, all countries basically benefit the same from institutional improvements. No matter where you improve institutions, improvements always lead to higher crop yields. It's just higher initial values mean the countries respond faster. So if you would globally improve institutions everywhere the same, the countries with the best starting institutions would improve first. But after 5 years, so just after a small leg, all the countries would respond positively. So that's on average, at least what we find here. So it's just about the speed of adaptation, but not the overall effect.
David, I was wondering, I understand the intention of including the 3 nodes and how the effects can change depending on where the country is about the institutions, but can you explain a little bit more operationally, how do you introduce these nodes, like in the estimation?
No, I cannot explain that. That was done by Wolfram. So basically what he tried to do here is to do everything that we did before. So all the same logic, just to, instead of using a linear regression, do it in a non-parametric way. But I don't know exactly how this is done.
Okay, and just another question about the Fraser indicator, like how well this indicator can represent or reflect the situation in the border. How do they collect this information? And because sometimes we think that the institutions are not as strong in the border, and how can that affect your results?
Yes, very good point. There are even 2 things here. First, the Fraser index, what we're using here, is really at the country level. So this is just the value for 1 year for Colombia. So it does not reflect the specific situation at the border. And you could, for many countries, assume that the institutional influence is high in the capital, and the more you move away from the center of the country to the borders, the lower the influence or the importance of the country institutions. Probably in some places, the state really has low influence, especially if it's a country that with certain topography, big and so on. So you could think that probably at what we find at the border is like a lower bound for what's really happening in the whole country. Because if we find the influence of the national institutions at the border, by all expectation, we would think it's bigger if you're more central. If you're in the main part of the country where the state is really present, the effect should be bigger than what we see in the border. The other thing is, our institutions are the very general institutions of the country. They are not agriculture specific. So again, you could think there's a major difference whether property in the country is in general safe, or whether agricultural land is safe, or credit market regulation, whether in general credits are regulated in a certain way, or whether agricultural credit is regulated in a certain way. So that is also to keep in mind. We have multiple edges of logic around here. This is the effect of very general country level institutions on crop yields far away from the main sphere of influence.
Thank you, David.
Yeah. Okay, so to summarize the results that we have so far. So we have found that it takes a little bit of time for institutional improvements to have an effect on crop yields. And after 5 years, basically, the effect stabilizes. We find this nonlinear effect that in earlier years, the reforms capitalize faster for higher baseline levels. But in the long term, linear is fine. So for almost all of the paper, we just rely on very standard OLS regression. We don't have to do anything fancy here. So also for the next, we will not change the legs anymore. We will just use the 5 legs that we found are stable. And then we just can focus in a linear regression on the Fraser index. So this is what we find. You can see for the different specifications, we changed the bandwidth. As explained before, it's not always exactly clear what's the right bandwidth. It is somewhere around 25, 30 kilometers, or let's say between 20 and 30 kilometers, but really depending on how you calculate it. In the most narrow bandwidth, we have 117 borders, around 7 million pixels, and 1,469 observations in terms of border year pairs. And we find, if you go this close to the border, that a change in the Fraser index by 1 point changes the crop yield by 1.5%. So you can imagine this as percent. 1.5%. If we go higher, it's 2.2%, 2.2%, 1.7, 1.9, 1 or 2%. So it stabilizes again. So we can say it's roughly in the optimal bandwidth. It's a little bit like 2.2%, little bit above 2% change. And yeah, you can see here how we get more observations when we increase the bandwidth. So we move from 7 to 23 million observations. We get, instead of 1,500, we get 1,860 border pairs. We get a little bit more borders also. But the result is really robust. And we do a lot of robustness checks, and this is what we find. We can do this nice exercise where we focus only on the borders where the side that was better switches at some point. So there are 39 borders where for a couple of years, one side had more free institutions, and then at some point the other side had more free institutions. We call these borders the switchers. And then we have 96 borders where it was always the same relationship. For example, for Germany, if we compare Germany to Switzerland, in all the years that we see, Switzerland had always freer institutions than Germany. It never changed. Okay, but the nice thing is here, if you look at the row where you can see the coefficients, we get a very consistent result. No matter at what kind of borders we look at, we get this 2.2%. So very stable finding. One more thing that we are interested in thinking about farmers is risk. How does yield variability change? Could it be that farmers have higher yield, but also more variability? That could be for various reasons. Might be that the farmers use technology that's more risky, so it leads to higher yields, but also maybe they switch to a variety that is quite sensitive. You need a lot of input, so if something goes wrong or if there's a drought, you have complete yield failure. Or it could just be that the higher you are, the more variation you just naturally get. So we divide our periods into 5 periods. So we have a little bit of interannual variability, and we just look at the standard deviation. And we find nothing, completely nothing. It's what we estimate is very close to 0 with huge standard errors. So there seems to be a yield improvement without any cost in terms of variability. So yeah, always very close to 0. And now we are coming to the question that came from the audience. Let's look at forests. So now we have many more pixels. Now we look at 351 million pixels around the world.
Sorry, David, we have a question.
Yes.
Juan Esteban.
Yes, thank you. Just a quick question before you move on to forest. I mean, I'd like to know what to make of this 2% change in yields. This is an average across borders where the change in the institutional environment is huge, and borders where the change in the institutional environment is very low. I mean, you mentioned Switzerland and Germany, I guess, like Germany and Austria. My hunch is that the change in crop yields between as you cross from Germany to Austria would be, I mean, close to 0. Whereas if you go from, I don't know, Costa Rica to Nicaragua, it might be huge. And then this 2% is just this average. And I mean, I sympathize with the average. I mean, I kind of believe with the number, but do you have any sense? Can you give us any sense of how this number varies across borders, or how it depends on the actual situation on the ground?
Yes. So the 2% increase is for each 1 point changed in the Fraser index. So the Fraser index is from 1 to 10, and then for each point change, it's 2.2% change in yields. And the surprising thing is what I showed with this graph with the nonlinear estimations. This seems to be fairly general. So it's still a complete global average. We have not yet done a lot of zooming into a lot of individual border analyses or so. We have so far only operated at this very broad level.
Okay, no, but now that you mentioned the nonlinear thing, I kind of get it. So this index is really absorbing this change in crop yields.
Yeah, so and it's really, if you look at this, that after this 5-year lag, so what we now use, the effect is the same at very high level of institutional quality and at very low. So basically we say on average, the effect is very similar whether you improve institutions in relatively poor countries or in relatively rich countries.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. All right, so these are the extensive margin results. These are unfortunately not as stable and perfectly robust as what I showed you before with the crop yields, which could be because this might have more measurement error. So there might be just more imprecision here. What we see is if we just want to explain whether a pixel is cropland or not, the nice thing is it's consistently positive. So that's good. There's a consistently positive effect, meaning pixels are more likely to become cropland or be cropland if institutions are better. But if you look at the p-values, this is not significant at very low bandwidth. It only becomes significant at wide bandwidth. And what I mentioned before, for most codes that you could use, we would say the optimal bandwidth is somewhere around 25, 30 kilometers. And here it's significant at the 10% level, and here not really anymore. So this is really what we would call like on the verge, like just at the border of where we could say there it's significant. But as I mentioned before, identifying on satellite images what's cropland and what's something else, especially in the tropics, it's quite difficult. Like in sub-Saharan Africa, with all these very small, irregular shaped fields, a lot of natural vegetation, there's a lot of different crops grown at the same time on the same field. Fields look quite natural. So it might be that a lot of cropland is missed, that we think it's shrubland or it's savanna, and it's actually the fields of farmers. So that could explain why it's not so significant. And then for forests, we find the opposite. We find consistently negative. So it seems like there's a reduction of forest when the institutions become better. And here it's significant at the 10% level only in the smaller bandwidth. So still, if we say 25 is optimal, this would be significant at the 10% level, but just quite on the border. So yeah, it seems at the global level, maybe this would also be more fair to here only focus on the tropics, for example, and not do this at the completely global level. But there seems to be a tendency that if you would follow these reforms to increase crop yields, you should be worried about your forests. So you should specifically also make sure you have strict forest conservation or something that takes care of this potential incentive that farmers want to expand their cropland. So make your institutions free for the crop yields, but then regulate for the environment, basically. Yeah, and then just to finish up, how am I with time? It's basically over, right?
Almost over, but please keep going. It's okay.
Okay, so I will wrap up very quickly. I don't want to keep people long. So I can just summarize this as what dimensions do we find? It's 2 dimensions. So we can summarize subscores that reflect different parts of the institutions. And there are 2 subscores that come back consistently. It's regulation and sound money. And we can zoom in more. It's government consumption, but that's just significant at the 10% level. What's really significant and together is basically the same like the joint effect. It's the top marginal tax rate, inflation, and credit market regulation. So exactly what you guys are doing. But these could, of course, proxy for related institutional characteristics. So this could be also be that they do reflect the influence of institutions, but it's not exactly them. So there could also be other things that countries do that have better values in these, and these are the actual detailed changes. But they're really reflecting how free the economy is, or how much the government is involved with the economy. And then quickly, what is it that farmers actually do differently in these countries? We don't have good data on irrigation at a high resolution, but we can measure evapotranspiration, so how much humidity is over the fields. This increases by itself a little bit if you have higher yields, but if it increases a lot, it shows that you have irrigation. And we do find that these are increased. So especially if we look over the entire year, there is pretty strong increase in humidity. So one thing that farmers do with better institutions is they adopt irrigation. And the other is, we wanted to check for mechanization. Unfortunately, again, there is no high resolution annual global data on machinery, but we can look at the peak of when the EVI, the highest EVI is reached, the date, because mechanization usually allows farmers to plant earlier. Farmers who are more mechanized are quicker than other farmers. So if the peak yield in the year is earlier, it's a sign that farmers had technical help. And that's what we find. Consistently, the peak EVI is reached earlier for these farmers when they have better institutions. So it seems like it's both irrigation and mechanization. So this is just a summary. We find a 1.4% increase in cropland when institutions increase and a 2.2% increase in crop yields. It's these macro variables that seem to be mostly behind this, and the mechanisms are irrigation, mechanization. And I guess I can skip the discussion, just the important point that I'm always making is that since we find this adverse effect on the environment, the message is not just to have no more regulation and let the economy run wild, but maybe find a good balance and try to combine the best of both. That's it.
Thank you, David. I have some questions, like 2 or 3 slices before you show that when you show the subcomponents of the index, precisely the government investments are not significant. And in many countries, especially the developing countries, a lot of investments in agriculture come from the government. So how can we explain that the government consumption is not as significant, but and I didn't understand also the part where you link this evapotranspiration with irrigation. How do you make that connection, especially in light that the government consumption is not significant?
Yeah, so the problem with the government consumption is because it probably is a combination of positive and negative things. So the issue here is that governments play so many different roles. For the Fraser Index, they assume that more government consumption is a bad thing. They assume that an economy is more free if the government stays more out of the economy. The problem with agriculture is, as what you mentioned, agriculture is special. And very often, agriculture benefits a lot from governments because the governments are actually the source of a lot of money and support. So it seems like probably this is not significant because it captures both aspects. So it's a little bit of a mix. It's not precisely measured. And then what you asked with how we link evapotranspiration with irrigation. Evapotranspiration is what we can measure with satellites. It's how much water comes out of the plants. If a lot of water comes out of the plants, this water must come from somewhere. So if there's a huge increase from one year to the next in how much water comes out of the plants, and we are controlling for rainfall and all of these environmental things, the only reason why there would be a discontinuity at the border in this and a change at the border would be the adoption of irrigation. So it would be, if you remember the image from Syria and Turkey from the beginning, if both places were brown, evapotranspiration was low. Once the Turkish side adopted irrigation, we could pick up the increased evapotranspiration.
But do you have is it possible that another way to kind of show better this link, maybe showing what is happening with irrigation between countries? Is there any data that can explain that?
The issue is for these things, we wanted to have an equally high resolution data set as our main. So we want to continue doing this at the one square kilometer pixel cell. So there's not that much available. Basically, we can only use things that can be measured with a satellite. Over 20 years, we have 83 million pixels. So we would not get this for modeled irrigation or whatever variables that could be available that measure irrigation. But the evapotranspiration is a pretty strong indicator. Like these big jumps in evapotranspiration we would not see for any other reason than irrigation.
I see. Well, is there any other question from the audience? Juan Esteban?
Yeah, just a quick observation, and following up a little bit on what on a question Carelis made, which is that you're using this phrase. I mean, I fully kind of believe your story, but there's the issue of how of the actual coefficients, in the sense that you're using country level Fraser indexes, which almost by construction do not really reflect the institutional environment at the borders, especially in, I don't know, far off countries like Colombia, where, I mean, almost by design, systematically, you're going to be probably, I don't know, underestimating the effect of institutions, in the sense that you're assuming that the institutions at the border are at the country average level. And I don't know whether there's anything you can do about it or not. Probably not. I don't know.
Yes, I totally agree with you. So the story is a little bit, if we find something at the border, the effect must be there, and the effect is probably bigger. So
Yeah,
that is a little bit
exactly.
the interpretation, probably.
Any other question? Well, David, thank you so much, and I hope we can continue talking and think about possible ways to collaborate in the future. Please wait for my email. I will email you very soon. And to all of you, thank you for attending the seminar, and see you next Friday.
Thanks a
Thank
lot.
you. Thank you, David.
Thank you, David. Good to see you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, David. I will email you. Have a good evening.
You too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.